Well, good morning, everyone. I'm Michele Acuto. I'm director of the Connected Cities Lab and associate dean for research in the Faculty of Architecture, Building and Planning. Before we start with any proceedings, let me kick off with acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands, probably multiple lands, in which we meet today, paying my respect to the elders past, present, and emerging, and extending our respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people that are with us today. So first and foremost, thank you for being with us this morning. Thank you for tuning in. Before I get on to introducing our StarCast panel and bring them in one by one into our conversation, I'd like to remind you all and encourage you to use the chat to put some thoughts, to share your research, to put questions to the panel, any reactions that you would like to have discussed or brought up into our conversation today. So making sure that this is as interactive as we can make it through the platform that is supporting the symposium. This is session 2 of the symposium, or the responding panel 2. So we're responding to Commissioner Penny Abeywardena's keynote on SDGs and Cities. In terms of introducing the speakers, you have bios, more extensive bios available for you to click through. So I'll just talk you through who they are and what their current role are, in no specific order, aside from the order that will be introduced in and speak to us about SDGs and Cities. So first and foremost, we have Director General Chingyu Yao of the City of New Taipei, with big thank you for her to take a bit of time out of the Moon Festival and the festivities, whether it's eating moon cakes or moonlight barbecues at the moment, and share with us their experience up in New Taipei. Following that, Tony Pipa from Washington, D.C., who's a senior fellow at Brookings Institution, and certainly one of the key voices on questions of SDGs and cities and animating that conversation over the last, at this point, few years, I would argue. Following that, we'll have Roger Swinbourne, who's associate principal and lead of the sustainability team at Arup down in Sydney, luckily, so able to step out of their lockdowns and walk around the city. And last but not least, and crucially, Commissioner Penny Abeywardena, the director of the New York City Mayor's Office for International Affairs, whose keynote was absolutely terrific, and I'm really looking forward to get stuck into the conversation on some of the themes that Penny brought up in her keynote. So big thank you again for doing that virtually for us as well. And sorry, everyone, if we can't share plentiful Melbourne coffee on International Coffee Day. I'll stop yabbering about and I'll get going with our panel, because that's what we're here for. So if that's good for you, let's get going with Director General Chingyu Yao from New Taipei. Thank you.
Morning, everyone. Morning and evening. And as Michele mentioned, indeed, it's our Moon Festival in Taiwan. Traditionally, family members get together on this day. So I'm here together with everyone online at the end of this very turbulent year. So that's just wonderful. And we've all watched Penny's presentation. I think Penny's talk sent us a really strong message that international partnership is more important than ever. And it is especially important for Taiwan, very crucial for Taiwan, as we are not a member of many of the international organizations like the UN or the WHO. So when New Taipei, we're the largest city in Taiwan. So when we decided to make SDGs as part of our City Vision 2030 last year, and we didn't know what to expect from our international partners. So in the beginning, we just did what we think is the best for our city and for our citizens. For example, you can see the launching press conference is a very traditional village-style banquet, and we want to build awareness from the bottom up. But in January last year, when we see Penny actually unboxing our VLR special edition and posted on Mayor's Facebook, we were just so exciting. That's the first time we feel SDG is a bonding vision between cities, and that could help us to find partners internationally that have shared values and vision. So the journey so far has been really rewarding. For example, in February, New Taipei is the only city from Taiwan that was invited to participate in the World Urban Forum 10th. And at that time, New York City has invited New Taipei to join the VLR declaration. And our mayor has quickly signed the declaration at the town hall meeting and shared it with our 4 million citizens. So again, the journey has been really rewarding so far. But very quickly in March, the COVID-19 hit. So that's really a big challenge for us if we're still seeking and enhancing international partnership under SDGs. As you can see from this presentation, so the line above is showing you some of the key events when we are combating COVID-19 in New Taipei City. But while we're controlling the spread of the virus, I think the global partnership has been strengthening globally. Just to give you a few examples, that we issued a pandemic control measure handbook in English, and we also donated PPE to some of the key partners with us, especially when we have enough supplies of PPE, but when they couldn't get enough. For example, San Francisco, and of course, New York City, and our sister city, Cincinnati, in the US, and some of the partners in Europe. We also held a meeting between American Institute in Taiwan with our local manufacturers, encouraging them to produce more PPE products. We hold a very high-level meeting with the Bay Area, sharing how we reopen the schools, how we did the early control measures in our cities. So I think that there are too many stories and examples I can give you, but COVID-19 really didn't stop interaction among cities, but facilitating them, the partnerships. And I think the partnership is not just among international cities. Partnership also should include within the country. For example, the partnership between the central and local governments, between the government and the people. So I'm not going to talk too much about the central and local government partnership. I can give you plenty examples during the COVID-19. For example, tracking, for about quarantine, for PPE supply, for campus reopening. But there's one thing I would like to highlight regarding partnership between government and people, especially young people. During the COVID-19, we have invited many young interns into city government, and we try to make their voices to be heard, because especially for this year's newly graduates, it's very difficult for them to find employments or internships. So we try to encouraging them to become the city's energy data agent. So we will help them to release a VLR special edition regarding our economic and energy recovery from COVID-19 from the perspective of the youth. So this is just one of the examples to tell you how important is the international partnership and partnership between central and local government, and partnership between the government and the people. So I think a lot of people are also interested in knowing how Taiwan is controlling the COVID-19. I have to say, so far we are controlling it relatively well. We have only so far 500 cases and 7 deaths. Considering how close we are to mainland China, we're only 100 miles away, and we are one of the countries that have early cases. Our first case is in January 21st. So we started the control measures very early on. So many of the reports have recognized that Taiwan to be an epidemic prevention model. And just like this picture that shows you, we could live a new normal life in New Taipei. We are home of 20,000 factories and 130,000 companies, and pretty much our companies and factory could operate as usual, of course, with highly cautious control measures. So compared to the world, New Taipei, we still have a economy that is going on. We are not hit by COVID-19 as strongly as most of the countries and cities around the world. So that brings us to think about why. And that makes me think about something that is very, very important in Penny's message. That is how to stay resilient, how to build cities resilient. So I think Taiwan has built up its resilience. We learned lessons the hard way during the 2003 SARS crisis. As you can see on this screen, we have experienced the SARS. We are hit by SARS the strongest. You can see from the cases numbers are shown on the table. So in 2020, when COVID-19 hits, our people chose to wear face masks even before the government urged them to do so. We support the central government to control the borders. And we also upgrade and amend our regulations in 2003. So our medical system, which is very important, they have been very well prepared for respiratory disease spreads. So all this, the experience, the lesson we learned in 2003 has helped us to stay resilient this time. But we're thinking when the world has stopped and when New Taipei City is still turning as usual, in this sense, are we missing an opportunity when the rest of the cities are making changes? Are we missing an opportunity to upgrade, to change ourselves this time? Are we prepared enough for when the next epidemic hits, or even when the next wave hits? So remote work is not so familiar now in Taiwan, even though it's quite familiar all around the world. And many of the people, like I was talking to Tony Pipa on another forum, a lot of ideas about new urban design has brought up to prevent and adapt to the next outbreak. And so far, our city government hasn't thought about a lot of revolutionary changes about our urban planning policies. We need to stay resilient. And for this, we need international partnership more than ever. We've also seen a wave of COVID refugees coming back to Taiwan from many of the countries. They sought refugees in Taiwan for the time being. So that could be also a golden opportunity for Taiwan, even though we're not experiencing such a hardship or a lockdown in Taiwan, but we can learn from all these friends that are coming back to Taiwan now. So I think I need to wrap up now. Just one thing from Penny's presentation, I believe we need to strengthen international partnership and keep an eye on each other and keep inspiring each other. Thank you.
And thank you as well, Director General. I think it's a fitting then move on to Tony up in DC. So Tony, on to you for your response.
Thank you, Michele, and thanks to both Penny and the Director General. I'm going to pick up on some of their themes, and I want to do so from two different perspectives. One, Michele, you mentioned the work that we're doing with groups of cities around the SDGs through our SDG Leadership Cities Network. And these are really cities that are in the vanguard of trying to apply the SDGs to their local context. And so I want to, I think, lift up a few of these themes and provide some examples of how they're manifesting also in some other cities around the world. But I'll also do it from the perspective of someone who actually sat at the table at this General Assembly, but representing their national government. I wasn't an urbanist. I'm not an urbanist, you know, and this is, let's be frank, this is an agenda that was agreed to under the auspices of the UN at the nation state level. So it's a framework that starts with the national and global perspective in that way. And it's interesting to me that SDG 11, which is, you know, shown as the quote unquote cities goal, was what we were thinking about when we were at the table, trying to take into account the rapid urbanization that was happening and what it would mean for sustainable development. But to pick on a couple of themes that that both Penny and the Director General were talking about, COVID, you know, has once again exposed how much on the front lines mayors and cities are on global issues, right? And it's not just, they are not just instrumental, they are the ones actually leading the beginning of the response on what is essentially really a global challenge. And it's the same way for the SDGs. Very interestingly, you know, something that's surprising to me coming from the perspective of someone who had represented their nation state, because local leaders see this framework, they see themselves first as independent, and they see themselves as, and their citizens see them as responsible, not just for SDG 11, but for the entire breadth of the SDGs. And because they are the ones that are, they're the level of government that are closest to their people, they're the ones that can turn these big aspirations into concrete things that really solve specific problems for specific people in specific places, right? So I think that's the first point I want to make, is just that local leaders really see themselves on the front lines of the SDGs. They're the ones turning something that is wide-ranging and ambitious into something concrete. And so you see a mayor like Mayor Claudia Lopez of Bogota, who was just recently elected. She came in January, and her entire platform and her city strategy actually is within the framework of the SDGs. That's how she talks about it. She links what's happening locally up to that global perspective. And you see it also in like Mayor Marvin Rees in Bristol, again, using the SDGs and in fact, almost as a community organizing tool, as a way to have partnerships across the entire city with leaders from business, civil society, philanthropy, university, partnership with the university. And all of those particular sectors working together to help plan against and align against the SDGs. And as both Penny and the Director General were talking about the local reviews that they do, those reviews become a coherent narrative of the different parts of the SDGs into what the city is trying to achieve for their citizens. I think I'd also really like to pick up a theme that I heard Penny talk a lot about, which is equity and the importance of equity. And I think what's really interesting is that cities are showing how equity is actually at the center of sustainability. When we say the Sustainable Development Goals, especially for those who aren't familiar with them, they immediately sort of think of the environmental aspects of sustainability and protecting the environment and protecting our natural assets for, you know, future generations. But the SDGs ask us to say it's really about long-term community viability. And for communities to be viable over the long term for those generations, they also have to be fair, they have to be just, they have to be more equal. And so COVID really shows us how connected individual health is to social health, to economic health, and to environmental health. And you see cities that are trying to apply the SDGs take that really into account. You heard Penny describe how New York City actually created a commission around equity and the policy recommendations that they're coming up, and how important that is to the centrality of their own strategy. It's interesting to look at a city like Milan, which is really pushing the envelope on the environmental side. And in fact, during COVID times, they're accelerating turning city streets into more pedestrian and having greater mobility for pedestrians and bike walkways, and allowing restaurants to take up more of the city streets, and undergoing construction this summer to do that, 22 miles within the city, to keep their air cleaner, to make it more difficult for cars to come in. But one of the first things they did in response was also to create a mutual aid fund, which was public funds then matched by private funds to get to those that were hit hardest and were most vulnerable, and which COVID exposed to be most vulnerable, that became unemployed, and also to help small businesses. You saw the same thing in Bogota, which actually created a cash transfer program for people in the informal settlements there, that was working in partnership with the national government to add on to that. Pittsburgh, a city actually that is creating metrics around equity so that they can look at and disaggregate where particular neighborhoods and particular demographics are lining up on sort of prosperity and the extent to which they need to use their policy prescriptions to be able to target those particular groups. So I think putting equity at the center of sustainability is actually a core part of the SDGs. And I think local leaders are really showing how important that is and making that concrete in the policies that they're undertaking. And then I also want to pick up on another theme that I heard the Director General really talking about, and that is that in this time of COVID, you really have mayors and local leaders dual tracking. They are still very much the front lines of a health emergency, right? And they're trying to keep their citizens and public safe and healthy. They are going to be the front lines of vaccine dissemination whenever that occurs, for us to really get things back to a place where people feel safer. So they have to be thinking about that, and they have to be focused on that at this particular moment. But they also realize that COVID sort of strikes at the existential heart of a city and of people gathering and coming together. And so they're thinking about what it looks like, what a future looks like that is different than the status quo before COVID hit. And the SDGs are providing them a way to think about that and a blueprint to be thinking about that. And they're doing that planning with their citizens right now. Mannheim, Germany, to the extent to which the Director General was talking about how they were engaging their citizens, they're using the SDGs as a way to do focus groups, to do surveys, to think about what their long-term plans need to be. And you, and Michele, you know this, you see it also in the city-to-city networks and the city partnerships that are happening globally, and the types of pledges for a green and just recovery that, say, the C40 network has put together, or what the Cities for a Resilient Recovery are also focusing on. But it's difficult because you've got to move now and be relevant now as you think long term. And the SDGs provide you that platform for global exchange of lessons and innovations with your peers globally. I'll leave it at that and look forward to the longer conversation.
Brilliant, thanks, Tony. Thanks a lot. And again, very fittingly, moving then on to Roger. With big thanks actually for having helped with Arup yesterday in the plenary workshop, fittingly titled "Leave No One Behind." So I think we're following on a very common thread here. But Roger, on to you.
Yeah, thanks, Michele. Look, it's great to be here today, and I guess from my perspective, I'm coming from as the lead of the Australian practice of Arup in sustainability and resilience. I lead up the team that works on major infrastructure and urban development projects with a focus on embedding sustainability and resilience in major infrastructure at district scale, at precinct scale, and at city scale. So we've had an opportunity over the last couple of years to really look preferentially at using the UN SDGs to define define the vision and the direction and delivery of some of these major projects, which has been really insightful in how to utilize and take that global framework that Tony was talking about and really localize it down into the kind of the project level and the city level. So I think it's been a really interesting process in its own right. I think just reflecting on some of what Penny was talking about in her presentation around using the UN SDGs to define a common language and sort of simplify some of that complexity, and Tony talked about it as a coherent narrative, and the use of the UN SDGs as a coherent narrative is so important because we're dealing with the inherent complexity and the systems integration of sustainability as a concept. We need to have something to help us hang a common language and understand at a very global level what that means. And as a consultant in this space, it is really useful for us to be able to point at something bigger. Historically, we had sustainability challenges and frameworks developed at city level from sort of bottom up, and they were always slightly inconsistent and different, and it means it's very difficult to get that consistency, which I think is really important. And I think, Penny, your experience and from the New York perspective sort of touched on that. I also think, Penny, in terms of the discussion around exchanging best practices between cities and using, once again, a common platform to enable that, but also the benefits of sharing, I've seen that, like I say, each city defines and has different drivers around sustainability. They're coming at it from different perspectives. The population that is within that city have very different perspective of what better looks like in the future. And I think the idea and the ability to use a framework like the UN SDGs to be able to do that, but also exchange that between cities, it allows this really good ability to share and communicate what is important and what those experiences are. I think really the kind of embracing of the sustainability agenda at city scale has been really, really useful to have something like that as a framing convention. I really like the idea of One New York City 2015, which built on previous plans with ambitious goals to leverage the direction set. So you're building a narrative using the UN SDGs as part of that, but also not throwing away what's been done, and using that kind of process and building the SDGs as an ability to build a consistent and growing narrative towards an outcome, I think is really critical. I also see, in terms of the differences that different drivers for sustainability at cities does mean that localization is really, really critical. And I think that empowers local governments and city governments to really take that framework, test it with the community, test it with the key stakeholders, review their governance structures. Every city has different governance structures, different control levers, different incentive mechanisms that it can use. So they need to be localized. We can't just apply the same process at all cities globally, because there is that point of difference around how to actually realize. But also there's local partnerships and people that are more or less aware of the levers that they've got available to actually progress towards the use of the UN SDGs and more sustainable outcomes. I think there's a really interesting emergence as well globally at the moment around where sustainability is being valued. I think city governments and local governments have had a remit for a long time to manage the social, environmental and economic performance of the cities and look at their controls and the levers that they can use to enable that. I think where it's getting really interesting is we're seeing a shift of industry who's realizing that if they're not managing it, they're increasingly exposed to the environmental, social and economic context at which those organizations are sitting and operating within. With the emergence of ESG, TCFD and other responsible investment components, the need for cities and governments to make sure that if they are wanting to build infrastructure that is investable, it has to have elements where it's managed the sustainability opportunities and the resilience risks that sit within the infrastructure planning and coordination. I think this is really interesting because I think there's also, it's coming in line with the sort of the accountability and forced transparency that we're seeing for both government and industry through social media. The accountability that is now being held by large corporates if they do if they do drop an environmental or a social ball, they could get $1 billion wiped off their share price because the market will hold them to account. 10 years ago, they would have dropped an environmental social ball, been wrapped over the knuckles and fined. It now is material in the sense of the financial value and the shareholder value that is seen by that asset. And I think that's really interesting opportunity for cities to actually start to realize that real value that sustainability and resilience can provide, not only from a social responsibility and environmental responsibility, but from an economic and, at the end of the day, a financial and accountability. I think the other really interesting opportunity that we've got around the UN SDGs is they do provide a lens towards the future. And I think in using that lens towards the future, if you think about what our responsibilities are as city planners, when we're planning infrastructure that will be in place in 50, 100, 200 years' time, we're creating urban structures that have got a very long-term approach to them. How are we planning for that? We're planning that with current stakeholders, with a current lens of regulation, current lens of planning. How do we actually project what is needed? What are the opportunities? What is the world expectations going to be in 10, 20, 30 years' time? And how do we make sure that we're accounting for those future generations in making the planning decisions we're making today? I think we need a framework to be able to enable us to do that. And I think the opportunity of using the UN SDGs to help us in framing that is a great opportunity, and it provides a really solid framework that is globally agreed to enable us to leverage that process. I mean, that's why I guess Arup as an organisation now has signed up or is using the UN SDGs through all parts of the project. Every go no go project that we have. So the decision to make whether we should or shouldn't go a project is now being assessed within this region against the UN SDGs. Every project we assess. Should we go for this? Should we not? Let's look at the UN SDGs. Is it working for the better future, or is it working against it? How do we interpret this particular project, and how do we optimize what we can do on this project to leverage and realize that benefit? And I think that sort of approach is useful across the broader scope of what we do. We're making decisions every day. What do we use to inform those decisions? What is the framework that we use? Is it our experience? Is it a future lens? How do we balance the regulations versus the outcomes? I think it's a really interesting opportunity, I guess, as from a coordinated infrastructure planning perspective, to work towards the delivery of a common goal and taking a systems thinking approach to the integration of those sustainable development goals in the way we plan, but also, I guess, plan with a focus on impact and outcomes and not just input and output, which is kind of more the traditional approach. And if we think about outcomes and impact, we need to understand what that outcome and impact need to be. So I think, yeah, the UN SDGs provide a really interesting framework for cities and infrastructure in relation to this. And yeah, I was inspired by the presentation, Penny, and looking forward to the discussion following this session.
Great, thanks, Roger. And last but not least, and I guess circling back from a pretty high-level game of SDG paraphernalia that New Taipei put together with the blocks that made it virally, I gather that Penny's SDG soccer ball is also making it virally. So Penny, the seriousness of it,
Thank you so much.
It's always at the head. So on to you, Penny.
Thank you so much. First of all, greetings from UN Plaza in New York City. It is 8:40 p.m. and it is such a pleasure to join all of you. I want to thank you and Kathy for inviting me to participate and provide the presentation that I hope some of you have watched. This is a hard role for me because I'm better when I'm combative and I don't disagree with anyone, and just appreciate all the additional thoughts that they threw in to sort of really fill out some of the topics that I talked about in the presentation. A couple of things that I just want to reiterate that I heard the Director General, Tony, Roger, pull out is the the complexity and thoughtfulness of which cities and local governments are showing up with the SDGs. As Tony mentioned, this was, it was a national government experiment project, which was such a huge deal in, when they agreed to it in 2015. And while we as a city, we were just a year into the de Blasio administration, this was April 2015, we launched One NYC, which was building off, but really looking at not only sustainability and resiliency here in New York City. We are huge. We are as large, if not larger, than 141 countries. So we're really trying to lead from the perspective that local government policy does make a difference in your life, and how are we thinking and planning and looking at sustainability long term. And so when we launched our One NYC agenda, the same year as the SDGs were agreed to, one of the first things my office did was identify the synergies. We had a strong equity lens when we were looking at our One NYC agenda around sustainability and resilience. And we thought maybe with that equity lens, this would align us with the SDGs. It turned out it aligned us perfectly. So we created what's called, with our platform called Global Vision Urban Action. And this to me, reflects a little bit on one of the PowerPoint slides that the Director General had, but this can't just be about government and government to government. Something that I became very aware of as I started talking about the SDGs, not only to my staff, but to my colleagues throughout city agencies, they aren't thinking about, their work in this sort of global framework. And so there was so much that needed to be done to prepare us to be able to talk to other cities and be able to create this platform for exchanging best practices. We had to do internal work. I had to work with other agency heads and other colleagues throughout our Department of Transportation and Sanitation and the agencies that are really doing groundbreaking policy work on the different SDG areas. But we also needed our everyday New Yorkers to care, right? As a local government, we're paid by taxpayers. And it became very important. How are we making the global movements around the SDGs relevant at home? And so one of our signature programs that we also launched in 2015 is called New York City Junior Ambassadors, right? We are home to the United Nations, but so many of our young people have not had a chance to connect with the UN and the global community in a substantive way. In fact, when I was in Staten Island sort of marketing this program in late 2015, I talked to a principal who told me that 70% of his students hadn't left the island of Staten Island. So the UN, just an hour away, couldn't have felt further away. And so it became very important to really engage these young people in thinking about the SDGs, understanding that they are part of global movements, whether it's on gender equity or whether it's on climate, but for them to recognize their change and their power is what they're going to do in their community. And it's been that sort of that holistic approach to our ability to connect with other cities that we are really proud of over the last few years. And the declaration really, not the declaration, but the voluntary local review idea really came from, not trying to undermine or usurp member state power at the UN, but recognizing how much we were doing. And to be completely honest, in a very American, complicated political context, we had our national government pull out of the Paris Climate Accord, and within 24 hours, New York City committed ourselves directly to that. Working with the U.S. Conference of Mayors, we have over 350 or 400 cities bipartisan throughout the U.S. And so we just really wanted to show how the issues that are affecting our communities we are representative of, and why can't we be part of that conversation? And so that's where the voluntary local review idea really came from, and how we were able to recruit other cities. Helsinki, and the mayor of Helsinki was the first to join us. But in that conversation, it became very clear that everyone, and I thought Tony did a brilliant job of giving all the different examples of different cities showing up on the SDGs, and some have committed to the voluntary local review. But we recognize, depending on region, size, what their political context was with their central government. Everybody had a different runway in terms of how they related to the SDGs, how they could submit a voluntary local review. So we launched the New York City Declaration for the voluntary local review last UN General Assembly, which was a lot louder and brighter than this year, unfortunately. But that was a moment when we had, 24 cities that had signed up. Now we have over 220 cities and local governments that have committed to the declaration to a voluntary local review. And so it just shows the desire to be part of this movement that is so actionable. And the Director General said it, this is about how we are exchanging best practices. We know as city workers, as city employees that are relating to our communities, that we have to relate and react to what is happening in our communities. And we have seen that, unfortunately, just take on a different level of urgency because of COVID-19. I think many of you know that New York City was the epicenter of the pandemic in the US. Between March and May, we had days when we had over 5,000 positive cases and 800 deaths per day. It was a terrifying, tragic time in New York City, but it was also a very important time for us to keep our connections to other cities and states and what was happening and best ideas and best practices that we could implement immediately alive. So we have just witnessed and experienced the importance of this city network and city and state network. I don't want this, some people just think it's like big cities talking to each other. It's not. It's small towns. It's regional, there's regions. The state of Para in Brazil is party to our voluntary local review declaration. So it has just been an extraordinary time. And I think, unfortunately, COVID-19 is, of course, giving us an opportunity to rethink what our new normal is going to be. And it is more clear than ever, I think, that cities and local governments have to be at the table and our leadership needs to be acknowledged and be part of the conversation.
Brilliant. Thanks, Penny. I was easily staring through what you've created as an extremely lively chat in the platform as well. So we've got a lot of people talking about a lot of things that all of you have already jumped in to comment on. So I think it's super. So I'll jump straight into sort of passing on a few questions and a few things. I'll direct them to a couple of you, just sort of make sure that everyone has a chance to chime in, but feel free to sort of jump in as well if you want to. So again, in no specific order, we're just picking up a few things that have come through. I might direct this one to Tony and Roger, and the next one to Chingyu and Penny. And the question for Tony and Roger is, I guess, sort of a healthily skeptical question that goes along the lines of, if about 55% of the people currently live in cities, that mean that 45% don't, how can the relationship between cities and rural areas be more mutually beneficial as a symbiosis rather than parasitic? And if I can, I'll ask also a question directly immediately to Chingyu and Penny, and it's a question about the international side of the story, and sort of if you can elaborate a bit more on how can international actors help cities when local government capabilities amongst countries, and I would argue probably even within countries, vary so much. So what is there in the capacity of international actors to help if capabilities vary substantially? Can we start from Tony and Roger first?
Thank you, Roger. Thanks, Michele. And so I think it's a great question, and it goes a little, and Roger mentioned this a little bit. I think it goes to the promise, at least, of the SDGs as a common language and connective tissue. That we often talk about it in terms of the Goal 17 partnership and how it helps line up different sectors of a city's governance and being able to work together. But it also can align actually across different levels of government as well. Orlando, for example, and I think they have 8 different surrounding counties, and then I think somewhere in upwards of 40 plus municipal governments are all part of a regional resilience planning process that is using the SDGs as their framework to be thinking about how they ought to, as a region, be integrating to be more sustainable. And if you think about the SDGs from a rural perspective, there's actually quite a lot in there that speaks to the challenges that rural areas are experiencing right now in sort of the global economy that's primarily an agglomeration economy where there is a lot of financial and intellectual and human capital that is concentrating in cities. But you've got natural assets that need to be maintained not just for that particular area, but also for actually the benefit, for the long-term benefit of the urban areas in which they would be feeding as well. And so it provides, goals are not prescriptions. And so if everyone is signing up to those particular goals and saying, we need to work together regionally to be able to achieve this for ourselves locally, I think it provides a platform for integrating interesting conversations across differences of size and differences of local governments.
Yeah, I agree, Tony. I think that's the idea of the scalability of the SDGs as a framework that can work across rural and city boundaries, I think is at all levels of governance, and identifying where that ability to control and influence sits, hopefully will start to actually streamline some of that. I think historically there hasn't been as much of that. So the actual application of the UN SDGs actually allows that connection better than historically it may have, which probably some of the issues that you'd laid out in your question have sort of cropped from that disconnect or the different framing of reference. So, yeah.
Great. Can we go to Penny and then Chingyu?
Sure, I can answer quickly. I mean, we're going to have different perspectives, but I think in terms of how international actors and actors is a very broad. we could put a lot of things in that. I want to sort of translate that question into how we can work together, and so I think at a very sort of basic, uncomplicated way, given how complex the political environment is amongst countries, amongst certain regions, this is why the SDGs are important. When my my colleagues who are experts in sanitation or road safety are connecting with their counterparts, whether in South Korea or Nairobi, it is talking about the issues and being able to share either what is working, what's not, our context, and just being able to get ideas. It's that policy exchange that has been very important. Obviously, in COVID-19, we are all, one city started a WhatsApp chain with, 50 or 60, cities on it. And we are constantly, especially in like the early days, we're constantly sharing ideas, right? And so that's one way to do it within this context of the question of like political challenges. I also know there's real conversations going on within different platforms around how to get better financing to cities, especially if they have complicated dynamics with their central government and what role multilateral institutions can play in that. And so I think there is just a lot of area of growth and opportunity that is going to happen, whether it's around financing, what it means within the international law context of what it means to be party to certain we created our declaration, but what does it actually mean to be party to other institutions? And so this is very much a work in progress, but I think again, the opportunity is that we're also committed to it. And this really does feel like, cities and local governments of all varying sizes and political leanings and all the things that you can add to it that are connecting because this SDG framework, the SDGs give us this framework and language to talk about the issues in a, I want to say uncomplicated, but it's very complicated sense. But I think you know what I mean. It just gives us an ability to talk directly to the issues.
Brilliant, thanks, Penny.
So regarding this, I really want to echo with what Penny said. So it's not a problem that capacities varies or when they are different. And when political system, each country, each city has different political system, religion is different, the development status is different, leadership is different, perception is different. COVID-19 just shown us how different each country it is to try to translate science into policies that can be implemented. We all know that we need to wear a mask, but when you do not have a community that is ready for that, and how can you translate science into policy? So what I want to say is that with a framework like SDGs, we are able to let the local government or the various society to know there is a framework that we can look at, we can take reference from. And from this framework, what we think, what Penny did, especially, I think she's really a champion, is to bring out the best, to give encouragement to communities that are trying to refer to this SDGs, but yet doesn't know how to give you encouragement and to make sure that the various becomes a great potential of diversity rather than competition or comparison. So I think SDG has, and the way how New York City Declaration has been exercising is to help to bring out the best from each city when we are implementing and designing policy around or under SDGs. So I think that it's a complicated question, but that's what I can echo with.
Brilliant, thanks a lot, and thanks everyone. There's really a flurry of more questions, so I'd encourage all, we've got a few ones coming back to you in the chats, but I would encourage everyone in the audience to connect individually during the breaks. That's a sort of an extra chance you have to discuss further, to use the breakout spaces and the networking sessions for this, as close as it can be to a real conference experience. I thought in the interest of time as well, sort of I might go back to everyone, asking you sort of a final comment, but maybe using a bit of chair's privilege, a quick comment on a question that had originally popped up in the chat as well, that I thought it was quite interesting and prompted a bit from exactly what we're doing now, as well as Penny's comment on using sort of WhatsApp chat. And I guess the question was framed on what links and what challenges are there between linking technology and equality in pursuing the SDGs from the city's perspective. So if you've got any sort of quick thoughts and reactions to the value or the challenges or the problems in doing so. And I might go around in reverse order again, so that we don't put on the spot Chingyu right away immediately, and start with Penny and go back to Roger, Tony, and Chingyu. So Penny, do you have any final remarks, any quick reaction to the question of technology and equality?
I'm like, where is that question? I'm going to let somebody else respond to that question. I just want to thank you all for convening this. You know, part of the challenge has also been the global aspect of the cities and local governments connecting, right? There's time differences. There's the accessibility. This is why the World Urban Forum and the work of UN Habitat has been so important, because they're connecting all of us. And so I just want to thank you for the time that we had in February, which has now, you know, sort of resulted in this conversation. But we are continuing the voluntary local review movement. The New York City Declaration is available. You can find that the language in terms of what the commitment is. And again, we purposefully kept the barrier for entry low. You know, we have had some incredible cities, for example, Los Angeles, they've mapped their budget to the SDGs, which is phenomenal, but we wanted to ensure that everybody who was interested could either encourage their local government or their city, so there could be citizen activists asking for voluntary local review, or there can be leaders in cities and local governments that see the value and want to engage right away. Please reach out to my office. We will happily have more conversations with you about how you can get better involved. And thank you again for creating this platform.
I'll quickly have a crack at answering that technology question. I think often we see technology as potentially the panacea or the silver bullet to some of these problems around sustainability and the SDGs. I think it is a very important part of our tools for as the solution architecture, but it's not it in its own right. I think for me, the ability to use technology to drive better transparency in decision making, but also in outcomes, is really, really useful in driving accountability for the UN SDGs. I also think that technology has an amazing ability to help us in planning scenarios. We can plan for millions of scenarios within minutes, whereas we used to have to spend months planning for those sorts of scenarios. So the technology to be able to actually look at scenarios, future considerations, plans, the kind of emergence of digital twins, helping us understanding what these policy and city level changes are going to be, I think is very powerful. It's a very powerful tool, but it's not the answer to our SDG problem. Tony.
So I'll pick up on that, and I'll make two final points. One, just a reminder that, you know, the leadership that local leaders are showing on the SDGs is an innovation in of itself. They weren't signatories to the agreement. They're taking on the entire agenda. And the VLR, I think, is a real reflection of that innovation. And to Roger's point, I think technology and data provides opportunities for further innovation. I think the first generation VLRs we have are a great, setting the stage for the coherent storytelling I was talking about. But I can imagine new VLRs, and I hope that we continue to really innovate around them. I can imagine VLRs that are very, very data driven, or maybe picture driven with spatial pictures of what's happening, or maybe they're a reflection of community meetings that have happened in informal settlements in cities in the global South. I would hope we keep that spirit of innovation going. And the last thing I'll end with is, this is pretty soft, but I continue to be shocked and surprised by this, is the power of the SDGs for people locally, how excited they get about a positive agenda, about what they are doing locally. To Penny's point about the local programs they've set up, about how what they are doing to work on progress at the local level fits into this global movement. It's something concrete, tangible, in a world where so much is changing and so many challenges seem to be cropping up one around the other, but it gives a positive way for people to participate in a global movement, and that's really exciting.
So technology alone cannot ensure equality, for sure. Everyone knows that. Data, I think last year has become the most valuable assets, more valuable than oil, all because of technology development. So I think one thing that SDG has helped us to understand the core perception, the core values of SDGs. Every policy that the government is taking has trade-offs. So technology and equality also has trade-offs. So we're in Taiwan. We know how technology can help equality, but can also harm equality. So one observation, and maybe something that I would like to thank this session and all the panelists is, when we're using technology, we always need to examine it through the lenses of diversity and through the lenses of SDG. For example, what I love about our session is the design of this session is just so SDGs. You have academic, you have industry, you have gender equality, and you have different perception. So when we can look at technology and how their implication through SDG and know that there are always trade-offs, and I think that could help us to reach the goal of equality. Thank you.
Terrific. Echoing everyone and saying a terrific session. Fantastic that the conversation has been very much on questions of equality as well. But a massive thanks from us to Tony, to Chingyu, Roger, and Penny for taking the time at a distance, doing it so without being bribed with flights, coffees, and Melbourne hospitality. A really, really fabulous session. And if I can add a big thank you to Megan and Sarah for coping with our accents, speedy chats, and my problematic management of the session. But for everyone as well, thanks for joining us in the morning, and we carry on at 11:15. Happy break, happy Moon Festival to everyone.